And this morning I want to talk about Passover in a slightly wider context. The Hebrew word is Pesach. And Pesach, translated, literally means to pass over. And when the Jews remember Passover, they remember more than just the occasion of the angel of death passing over Egypt. They also include in the whole story the crossing over of the Red Sea. So what we're going to do this morning is we're just going to look at that whole period from the point of Passover to the going off into the Red Sea. Now, the first thing to note is that what we'll find as you start reading in this passage, we're not going to read the whole thing through because there's 3 whole chapters here. But if you're just skimming through, what you'll see at the beginning in chapter 12 is that it starts to talk about the fact that the Passover preparation is being made. This is before the final plague of Egypt. This is a preparation that's beginning just before. And God actually says to them that I want you to treat this month, it's the month Nisan, we've got it highlighted in yellow there. I want to treat this month as the first month of the year, which is a little bit odd because what we actually find is that the celebration of New Year in Israel by the Israeli people actually doesn't come until the Israeli month Tishri, which is around about September or October. And you'll remember that we started the church. We discovered only a few days before we started that the evening of that day that we started the church, that evening was the start of the new Jewish year. But if you notice something, you notice that it's at the end of the 7th month. 7, a number of, that perfect number, that number of completion. And the number 8 is a new beginning. It's a new beginning. So they do celebrate this new year at the end of September or October in our calendar. But what is happening then is what happens next month is it's like a beginning, a new beginning. And what you might notice is now think about this as a map of time. We begin with a beginning. We begin with the creation of the world. There's then this period, this long build-up to the point where Jesus comes. And what we see in this month is we see several feasts come together. We see Passover, we see unleavened bread, and we see first fruits. These special feasts, and they are all actually packed into 1 week. And these periods all are a reflection of Jesus' work on earth. So that Passover is his death and resurrection. We see the unleavened bread, we see the first fruits of the barley harvest, and Jesus is the first fruit of the resurrection. So we have all of this all packed into that 1 week. And it's like, if you're looking at this as a period of time, that Jesus comes in this short period for the first time in the middle of history. Now, it's not to scale, this time map, but we then have a gap, and then we have the Feast of Weeks, which we call Pentecost. We call it Pentecost because the word Penti, 5, it's a reflection of there being effectively 50 days from Passover to Pentecost. And Pentecost is also the first fruits of the wheat harvest. It's the rest of the harvest, actually. It's everything else can come in. So the barley is just the first one. It's just one particular harvest. But this later one that happens at the Feast of Weeks is the harvest for everything else. It's the wheat and everything else. So the symbol here is that Jesus first came to speak to the Jew, first came to bring a message to them, But then at Pentecost, it was like the launch of the Gentile mission. The whole mission to the Gentiles is opened up, and that begins at Pentecost. All the rest of the harvest can be brought in. Then we have a long gap again, and then we come towards the end of this calendar, the end of this timeline, and what we're waiting for at this moment in time, we're waiting to hear the trumpets. We're waiting to hear about the second coming. We're waiting for Jesus to come, the sound of the trump when the dead in Christ shall rise and those who are in Christ will be caught up with them. It's when we receive our full atonement. At this moment in time, we are still living in bodies that are the part of the sinful life. But at that moment, we acquire our new bodies. The old bodies go. The full atonement takes place. The full blessing takes place. And then the very last feast of the year is booths. It's going out and dwelling in freedom. In fact, the Jews actually they build these little shelters to go out and stay out overnight in. There's a sense of freedom in going out. And that is where the end of their year is, that they see it. That's where Rosh Hashanah takes place then, and we then start this whole cycle all over again. Because what then happens for us, the believer, is that as we move from 7 to 8, we go into this new beginning of living the rest of eternity with Christ. It's a new beginning. The number 8 is that symbol of new beginnings. Now, what actually happened at Passover then? Let's just take a close look at what's happening here. Because Moses, when it first happened, when he came along, that's not to celebrate something that has already happened. The instructions he is giving is because of something that is about to happen. This is before that final plague that is about to hit Egypt. And so Moses instructed the people of Israel to go out, and on the 10th day of the month, the instruction was to go and get a lamb. The lamb was supposed to be a male, young lamb. Ideally, it was to be a firstborn lamb, but that wasn't a crucial one, but that was preferred if you could get one, a firstborn. And then you held it for a few days, and then on the 14th day of the month, you would then sacrifice it. And it's that evening then, on that 14th day, that you would then eat that lamb. And you'll remember that when we were looking at this in Easter, looking at some of these dates, we were saying that an Israeli month begins with a new moon. And so 14 days later, we have a full moon, and that's when this sacrifice is going to take place. So this is really what Moses was instructing the people to do on the 14th of Nisan. It was a day of preparation. So he said, don't go to work. The Egyptians, who relied on these people as their slaves, would have got up that day to go out to get on with stuff, and all of a sudden, where are the Hebrews? They haven't turned up today because they've got too much to do on this day. Far too much to do. They have to pack everything. They have to get everything ready. They have to work out how they're going to take their possessions now in order to leave Egypt. They have to work it out with neighbors, perhaps. Perhaps you haven't got a cart. Most people are not going to have a cart. You have to find somebody who has got a cart with enough room on it to be able to put some of your possessions. They have to mix the dough ready to be able to use, because Moses says you're not going to be able to wait for bread to rise. You need to just mix it without any yeast at all. You need to mix enough ready for your journey, and you're going to use some of that in that evening. You have to bake some of that ready for that evening. You then have to prepare any other food that's going to be needed, not only for that evening, but for the start of your journey. You also might have to prepare your house for guests. Because Moses said, if your family is too small to consume one lamb, then you need to get together with some other families and you need to eat it together. But that meant that you all had to be in the same house, because one of the instructions was that you do not go out of the house that night. In fact, they still do that to this day, that if they are having a meal where they've got guests over, they do not leave the house that night. Now, there was another reason for not leaving the house in this first Passover, because that was where your protection was going to be, because when you sacrificed your lamb and prepared it ready for the meal that evening, one of the things you had to do was to daub blood on the lintels and doorposts, which was a sign to the angel of death not to strike that household. You did not want to leave your house and be out on the streets that night. It would be too dangerous. So you had to prepare your house. Bear in mind, you're just about to move. You're just about to move house. So everything you've got is packed up, but nevertheless, if you've agreed to work with some neighbours, they've all got to come into your house and stay with you that night. Okay? Nobody's going to sleep, by the way, because you've also got to be ready to go at a moment's notice. So all that has to happen during the daylight hours of the 14th. Now, one of the other things we looked at on Easter Sunday morning was that the Hebrew day starts at nightfall. So as you can see there, we've got the dates along the top. We've got the 14th of Nisan there, and so it's during the afternoon that the lamb is sacrificed. And at the time of Christ, in fact, once Passover was now established as a regular feast, and the priesthood had been established in Exodus, then the next Passover they celebrated was one where they had to take their lamb to the tabernacle, and the priests would sacrifice the lamb and do that initial work on the lamb to butcher it. And by the time of Christ, that meant that the whole afternoon was going to be a very busy time at the temple. You had to get your lamb to the temple. You had to get it checked. You had to get it addressed. You had to get it sacrificed. And you had to get it home before nightfall. So the first day of Passover actually begins at nightfall on the 14th of Nisan. Let's pick a day, because it can fall on any day. It all depends on what day the new moon fell on. But let's use the example of a Wednesday. If the 14th of Nisan was a Wednesday, then on that Wednesday, you have to get everything done. You have to get all the work done. You have to get the thing sacrificed. And on Wednesday, as sun sets, that is actually the point at which the 14th Nisan ends and the 15th starts. So that 15th Nisan is the first day of Passover, and is the point where they've now entered into that day. Night has fallen. And so that night, they're crowded in their homes. They've got the blood daubed on the doorposts and lintels. They're inside, and it says that at midnight, the angel of death came along and began to take all the firstborn of Egypt. And any of those who in Israel that had failed to obey the command, had failed, if they thought, Moses doesn't know what he's talking about, and if they just ignored him and decided not to bother with any of this, then sadly they too would have suffered death of firstborn in their houses. And so they're sitting there that evening waiting. So what happens? We've talked about what happens on the 14th. What happens on the 15th? Well, at sunset, they've gone into their houses and closed the doors. They then begin to eat the Passover meal. And Moses' instruction was that nothing should be left over of this lamb to the following morning. You have to eat everything that night. That's actually why it made a good idea to actually get some other families in so that there were enough people to actually get that job done. It's part of the requirement. It's a nice way of forcing people together as well in community, that there was a real need to be able to do this. The instruction was shoes on, loins girded, staff in hand, ready to go. And at midnight, the angel of death passed over and the firstborn died. And it says, throughout Egypt, there was not a single household that was not affected. There was not a single household that did not have a firstborn person in their house that died. Every single household was affected. And so at midnight, this thing happens, and Pharaoh sends for Moses. Now, they haven't got mobile phones. They haven't even got landline phones. They haven't even got telegraph or whatever. What this means is that, first of all, Pharaoh has to call some people in. This is what I want done. You need to go and get Moses. They have to go and find a runner to go to him. He has to run. I mean, we've already lost an hour or so in that process. Grab Moses. Moses knows this is happening, so he's already dressed and ready. So it could easily have been an hour, maybe 2 hours before Moses has turned up. And this time Moses doesn't even have to ask, let my people go. Pharaoh says, get them out of here. Take them. Go. Take everybody. Take the lot. Go now. And so Moses is then able to go back again to Goshen, and he's able to start sending runners around house to house to be able to say to them, okay, we can go. Get ready. We're going now. I think they probably didn't actually start to move until early dawn, but they were on their way. They were going. Girding up your loins. Well, one of the other things it says is that they also needed to be ready and prepared for war in case they needed to defend themselves. So, what does that mean? Well, here's a nice little instruction on what to do if you want to know how to gird up your loins. First of all, you have to scoop up the main robe to your waist. Pull it all out so that it's tugged out tight. You then pass it between your legs and take it from behind. Then you separate it into 2 strands and bring it round the front and tie them together. And that forms a belt across the front of you. And that means that you've got complete freedom in your legs now to be able to run, to be able to move easily, and to be able to engage in battle. So if you ever want to know how to do that, there you go. I've got nobody dressed for that today. Okay. So, what then happens is that this feast moves straight into what is known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. On the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we have 7 whole days when they only eat unleavened bread. This is the bread that was mixed on day 1 and ready, carried in bowls, which what they usually did was kept them covered with a damp cloth to keep everything fresh. And they would then carry that. And then they would pull some of that off. So when they stopped, which was going to be brief, short nights and so forth, they would quickly use that to cook their bread, eat that for a meal, using some of the food that had been prepared the several days before, because they were trying to travel as quickly as possible. They were trying to put as much distance between them and Egypt as they possibly could. The other thing that God said to them at this point is, now, to do all of this, there was a requirement that I should take all of the firstborn. But for Israel, I haven't taken all of the firstborn. But there is still a requirement. You see, if you remember when we were talking last week, we were talking about the fact that there is a punishment going on for Israel for their idolatry. The plagues also, some of them affected Israel. There is a punishment. The whole reason they're in slavery, we discovered in Ezekiel 20, the whole reason was because while they were in Egypt, they had been taking on the Egyptian gods and worshipping the Egyptian gods. God has a demand to see this put right. And so he's saying, by the way, as they're all about to go, there is also going to be a redemption for all of the firstborn. So as part of this fleeing during the period of the unleavened bread, there is a physical requirement on the animals where the firstborn of the animals are put to death. And also, there is then a requirement, an accounting for all the firstborn of Israel. Now, it doesn't actually tell us here how they did that here, but that accounting was done by means of money. You will see that occur later. You'll see it dealt with in the book of Numbers, and you'll see that the accounting is done. How many firstborn are there? You'll see all the numbers calculated there. There's a certain amount of money per person. You will then see that money is gathered in order to pay for the redemption of each of the firstborn among the Israelites. So whereas God required the actual lives of the Egyptians, instead of their lives, he requires a payment to be made, which was made into the tabernacle. And we see that happen. He tells them that this is going to happen at this point in the story, but he doesn't actually do it until we see later in the book of Numbers. And so that redemption takes place. And what we also read in these passages is that they've just come out of Egypt. They're just starting their journey. And then God begins to show them. He says, I'm going to lead the way. And he then produces this pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. The implication is actually, because he's saying follow this, the implication is that if there was a pillar by night, they were moving sometimes during the night hours. They are trying to put as much distance as possible between Egypt and themselves. And so we have this pillar of fire that they could see at night and this cloud which they're following during the day. And God says, I want you to go to a particular place. He says, I want you to go to a place called Payhard Rif. Now, one of the things that I've often found interesting is that it says in Scripture, it talks about the Israelites being by the Red Sea and that Pharaoh's armies were held back by this pillar of fire. And you know, when I was a kid, I used to have these Bible stories in a book which had this picture which shows this desert, this flat area, with a single pillar of fire, and all the Egyptians all standing at one side of that going, ah! And I'm thinking, idiots. It's one pillar, go round it. It's one pillar, split your forces. Send some round one way, some round the other. It's not going to get you all. But God was smarter than that. And the illustrator of some of those kids' books was also not noticing something. In fact, what is interesting is that a full understanding of what was happening on that beach has only really come out within the past probably 20, 30 years. That what actually happened has not been realized until then. You see, part of the clue comes in the very name of the place that God had sent them to. We don't have a place called that today, otherwise somebody would have gone along and said, oh, there it is. Oh, I understand now. But all we have is this name that exists then. It doesn't exist today. So what is this word, Payhard Rif? Well, Pi, the first part, comes from the word pay, which means mouth. The second syllable, ha, means the. Har is mountain. So here comes from har, which is mountain. Oath is the feminine plural ending. But the normal ending is harim, which is a plural for mountains. But because it's a feminine ending, har oath, it means the gorges in between the mountains. So harim is mountains, har oath is the gap between them, the gorges. So what this word literally means is the entrance to the gorges. The implication is there's a lot of mountains, and they've come onto this beach through an entrance that leads into the gorges between the mountains. So in your mind's eye, think for a moment, well, that means you've got mountains and a gap between, and the beach is in front of that gap. When somebody finally figured this out, only a matter of 20, 30 years ago, they started to take a look at the Red Sea, and lo and behold, they found one place on the whole of the Red Sea that fits the description that explains exactly what is going on here. It's a place called Waber Beach. And there you can see this gap going into the mountains, which is where actually a river flowed down. And that river flows down, and it did produce a bit of a delta. It wandered about over the years, forming a delta shape, keeps moving, and has actually, I believe today, fallen into two rivers now. It's settled into two rivers that go down on either side of that delta into the Red Sea. But look, you go either way here, and you've got a problem. You're getting into mountainous area. The other thing is that this beach has to be big enough to take the entire population of Israel at that time. It has to be capable of taking up to 1.5 million people. And this beach is big enough to do that. And there were two cities there. There's one to one side that's described in the Bible, and there's one called Migdol, which must be at the top of the hill, because Migdol effectively means a city at the top of a hill. So there were two cities that could observe what's going on. What are they seeing? Well, one of the things they're seeing is a pillar of fire sitting in the entrance of that gorge. The Egyptians cannot get past that pillar of fire because it's blocking them. It's at the end of the gorge. They can't get round it. They can't skirt round it. They're not going to be able to get their chariots up the sides of the mountains to get around it. They can't. They are completely held back by that pillar of fire. And so the people of Israel are sitting on this beach waiting to get across. And God says to Moses, hold out your staff, and gives the promise that he's going to part the seas. And so Moses does this. Now, one of the things in Jewish culture is that they have both the written tradition, the Torah, the Tanakh, and they also have an oral tradition. And so when telling this story in a synagogue, typically what happens is that the leader of the synagogue will get up and he will read from the scroll the passage describing Moses standing up and holding his staff out over the sea and the sea parting. And when he's finished the story, he sits down, and then somebody else will stand up, and they will then bring the oral tradition, a verbal tradition that has been passed down from generation to generation to generation. Each generation is taught to be able to recite the story exactly word for word. They're not entrusted to stand up and speak it until they can prove that they can do it again and again, word for word, without any change. And the story that accompanies this is the story of a man in the crowd. He's standing there waiting for the Red Sea to open, and Moses is standing there with his staff pointed, and nothing is happening. And eventually this man decides that if we're going to cross it, we've got to show some faith. And so as the story goes, this man, this unnamed man, walks forward and steps into the Red Sea. And still nothing happens. But he keeps going. He's looking to the other side, and he keeps going. The water comes up past his knees. Still nothing's happening. Comes up to his waist. Still nothing's happening. Eventually it gets to his bottom lip, and at that moment, the sea parts. And Scripture tells us that the water was standing in walls on either side of them, just as we've seen it in the movie, the Ten Commandments. But there is another very interesting feature to this place. You see, once they started looking at this area very closely, once the archaeologists began looking at it very closely and saying, this looks like the place that it could be that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. Let's have a bit of a look here. Let's, for example, do scans down into the water. Let's find out what's happening in the water here, because this is a very deep part of the Red Sea. And I can remember when I heard this first being reported, they were saying, the point where they were crossing, this is the deepest part of the Red Sea. But this is the interesting thing. There is actually a land bridge between this beach and the other side. Yes, it is extremely deep on either side of this, but at the point of the beach itself and going straight across, there is a ridge underwater. It's actually about 300 feet under the surface. But there is this bridge that is there across from this beach to the other side. It's not just the fact that if the water had just receded, then it would be there. You would see this path across. But the Bible says that it actually parted and the water stood in walls on either side. So it's still a parting, but only at a depth of about 300 feet at its deepest. Now, what is an archaeologist going to do next? He's going to take a look. He's going to go down there and start to have a look. So what is down there? And these archaeologists did just that. And they got down there, and all along this land bridge, they found this. Entombed in coral are the chariots of the Egyptians, the bones of their horses and the men, the spears, the shields, everything, all in a line along this land bridge. And that is sitting there to this day. Anybody tells you this stuff in the Bible is a myth, the revelations that are coming today, more and more, that this stuff really happened. God really did do these things. And isn't it interesting that the Bible has provided the clues just in the name of the place? This Payhard Rif name is a big clue to where to look, where to find these things. And when you find it, you find more than you expect. Not just is this an ideal beach for this to have happened on, not only is it the right place for a pillar of fire to hold off an entire army, but there is this thing that is hidden that reveals this land bridge. It's the only ridge in the Red Sea from top to bottom, and it happens to be in the same place. And then you have a close look at it and, oh wow, there they are, the Egyptian army, at the bottom of this sea, across this ridge itself. Isn't that amazing? And so, the Israelites today, they can celebrate the fact, the Jews today can celebrate the fact, they're even more encouraged at having heard this. They can celebrate the fact that God has helped them to pass over. Not only did God help them in the Passover of the angel over the land and protected them through the blood of the Lamb. We've covered how all this speaks of Jesus, but also how he has led them to a place where they can pass over the Red Sea in safety to go on into the place where, and it's at this point that the power of Satan is broken. It's at this place that once they're past this, he can't get to them. He's cut off from them. Next week, we shall look at another aspect of this story of Exodus.